Hello, folks. Welcome back to WW2TV and a rare Saturday show. And this is part two and part three, depending on how you look at it, of our Pointe du Hoc shows. It's part two of Steve Zaloga's appearance, but part three if we include the wonderful presentation last night with Joanna MacDonald about the men of Pointe du Hoc. But today we're following up the excellent show that Steve did with us a couple of weeks ago. And it's all based, of course, on his brand new book, which I'm holding up there, Smashing Hitler's Guns. And the links that you will require to purchase that are in the description below, as they always are. And having covered the German aspect, so what was there, bunkers, guns, gun types, gun mounts, planning, all that. And then Joanna last night, the people, George Kirchner, Len Lamel, James Rudder. Today, we are looking at the actual Allied plan to deal with the threat at Pointe du Hoc and some of the things that happened during the course of that day and the planning and how it was adapted and what happened. And basically, we're calling it New Perspective. So as usual, folks, if you are new to World War II TV, I say it every time, but I have to. Don't forget to like what we're doing, share what we're doing with your friends, click subscribe so you get the notifications, and leave us a comment after the show. Even if you didn't like it, even if you thought we missed something else, comments help with the analytics. They help with getting more viewers in, because the number of new subscribers has dropped a bit as we've got into spring and summer and the pubs are open and people are traveling again. But for those of you who are here, brilliant. And the last shows were very popular. So I'm going to bring Stephen Zaloga in again so you know who he is. Prolific author, incredibly eloquent, incredibly knowledgeable. And we're going to bring him back in. So good afternoon, Steve. How are you today?
Good afternoon. Doing fine.
So, Pointe du Hoc, we discussed it with Joanna and we discussed it with you the first time. It is one of those stories that does get revisited quite often. And part of that is to do with just the fact that there are more archives available. You didn't just stop at the first documents you found. You carried on and went through all the boxes and all the information. And, we asked it to you first time, but it is the right time for a new evaluation of what happened there, isn't it?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of material that's never been explored. One point I try to make in my book is that you have to stand back from Pointe du Hoc and not view it simply as a Ranger mission. Obviously, the Ranger mission is the core of the story, but you have to step back a bit and look more broadly at D-Day objectives in order to understand why certain things happened. And that's what I try to do in the book. And that's one of the features I'd like to talk about today is what are some of those aspects that are overlooked or that help explain things from a different angle. Basically, the theme of my book is this was a combined arms operation. It involved the other services, the Navy, the Air Force. The Rangers obviously were at the center, but the objectives that were set out by the Navy and the Air Force helped to shape what the Ranger mission actually was.
Yeah, no, that theme came up with Joanna yesterday when she was talking about Eichner, particularly saying basically how the Navy saved their asses there later on. And, we know that it's an incredibly important story in terms of the Ranger legacy and history. And, when young Rangers come to Normandy, it's a pilgrimage for them. But their brilliance there is only as good as the brilliance of those, I'm not going to say support troops, because that sounds like they're a lesser role, but the additional firepower that's coming in, the Navy, the transportation, the air power, and all that. And indeed, as we discussed in the first show, the intelligence that had been gathered that provided the package that gave the 2nd Ranger Battalion the information they had to draw up their plan. So it's worth looking at. So as usual, you've come armed with a PowerPoint, so all we need to do is somebody when to move on, and we'll fire it up. And folks, we'll deal with questions kind of as we go through, and some at the end, and we'll just take us through Steve's new perspectives about Pointe du Hoc. So over to you then, Steve.
Yeah, well, I'm going to start off the next slide with just a brief overview of the subjects I'd like to deal with here. So if you can pop up that next one. First of all, I want to ask why Pointe du Hoc? Why was this mission carried out? Obviously, it was very dangerous. The idea of Rangers scaling the cliffs, you don't do this for a minor objective. This obviously had to be a significant objective. So I'd like to help define what that objective was. The second point is everybody seems to think that the Ranger mission started right off the bat with climbing the cliffs. And in fact, if you go and you pull the files down at the archives and you start looking deeper, for example, 5 Corps and the higher commands, it becomes quickly evident that that wasn't the case, that there was quite a bit of uncertainty about how the Rangers were going to perform this mission. I also want to deal a little bit with the equipment that the Rangers had in order to do the cliff scaling. It's pretty much a technical point, but I think it'll probably be interesting to the viewers. I also want to deal with the issue of the navigation snafu. This is the one thing that almost derailed the mission. And so I wanted to provide a little bit of detail about that because it's not a story that's particularly well known. And then finally, I wanted to make the point that although the Ranger mission at Pointe du Hoc is the best known aspect of the Rangers on D-Day, the operations by Force C in the Verville Draw area was in many respects just as important and arguably more significant in the overall Omaha beach battle. And this point was driven home to me by John Ron, the headquarters officer and the senior surviving ranger at the moment. I think at the moment he's 97 years old. He made that point very strongly to me when I was talking to him about this book project. So I think that that's an important aspect of it to discuss. So if we can jump over to the next one, why Pointe du Hoc? You have to step back a little bit and stop to think about other similar operations and the broader use of commando forces and special operations in previous amphibious operations. And so that includes the commando operations at the Dieppe raid in August 1942. It involves the Allied attempts to deal with French coastal guns in November 1942 during Operation Torch. In both these cases, Dieppe and Torch, the method used to deal with enemy coastal guns was to use commando raids. So in the case of Dieppe, the British commandos attacked German gun batteries on either side of Dieppe. And they have to be located on cliffs. The commandos had to use cliff scaling techniques to get up there to get to the guns. In the case of Torch, it was a mixed force. It was actually the first U.S. Ranger operation by the 1st Ranger Battalion, as well as by commandos and as well as by specialist infantry units. And the results were very mixed. Dieppe, one of the commando units was successful, one was a failure. Likewise, during the Torch operation, several of the missions went very well and others failed. So there's this legacy of failures at completely suppressing coastal guns. So there was a lot of thought about, well, what else can we do to make these raids more effective? Now, another important aspect of early amphibious operations is that the Allies tended to go for ports. And the reason is fairly obvious. You're conducting an amphibious operation. You're going to need to support the logistical needs of your forces once you're ashore. And therefore, the ports seem like the obvious thing. So Dieppe is a port. At Torch, there were 3 different ports in French North Africa that were attacked. Now, what happens at Sicily is that the Allies figured out that attacking a port is not a great idea because that's where the enemy defenses tend to be the thickest. It would be much better to attack across an open beach where there's not strong defenses. Now, by Sicily in July 1943, the Allies had come up with several very important tactical innovations that made that possible. And that includes new types of landing craft available in significant numbers. So the landing craft tank, the landing ship tank, and also amphibious trucks like the DUKW, which enables you to carry supplies over the beach without the need for port facilities. So that's an very important operational characteristic of the Allied forces that's absolutely critical to D-Day in Normandy. By Sicily, the Allies are displaying this new capability. And it's important to give the Allies the capability to land away from coastal guns. Because for those viewers who saw the earlier episode on the German point of view at Pointe du Hoc, the Germans have put very, very large concentrations of coastal guns up on the Pas de Calais. They think that that's where the Allies are going to come ashore. So there's lots and lots of coastal guns. There's lots and lots of coastal guns near the major Normandy ports, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Dieppe, other ports there. So the Allies want to avoid that, and that's why Lower Normandy is selected. Now, some of these campaigns in 1943 in the Mediterranean helped define what's needed to deal with the German gun threat. The most obscure is Operation Corkscrew, which is an attack on an Italian island between Tunisia and Sicily. And it's not really a significant campaign, except that it very clearly showed that aerial bombardment of coastal guns and naval gunfire bombardment of coastal guns alone are insufficient. they can temporarily suppress a coastal gun. They can do it for maybe a few hours, so they're well suited to part of the mission. But the Allies come back convinced that you need aerial bombardment, you need naval gunfire, but if you've got a real critical threat, a gun battery that's particularly dangerous, you need to attack it with special forces, because the special forces are going to enable you to keep the gun suppressed. The aerial bombardment and naval gunfire will suppress the guns, but the Germans can probably recover several of the guns. And that becomes clear in Normandy on D-Day. But this is an important lesson from the Mediterranean campaign. Finally, the Graham Report in January 1944 actually defines how much firepower is needed. Once again, firepower can suppress but not destroy coastal batteries. If we can jump to the next slide.
Just a quick question for you, because as a Brit, we often talk about the successful attack by the Air Special Raiding Squadron on the Cap Muro de Porco in Sicily with Paddy Mayne, and that was a gun battery, Italian man with kind of cliffs and a triangular position. Does that come up in any of the American archives? Because it comes up in kind of British archives as the evolution of how to kind of do assaults and things on naval batteries. But does it appear in American archives?
I've never seen it in the archives, but that's partly because the archives where they deal with British forces are obviously not as comprehensive as with American forces. There was very, very strong connections between the Rangers and the Commandos, so they were undoubtedly aware of that. I don't think it had a great deal to do with the specific planning, except to the extent that, of course, there was a Commando liaison officer attached to the Rangers, and the Commandos oversaw most of the Ranger training when the Rangers finally get over to the UK in late 1943 and early 44. So I strongly suspect that they were very well aware of the lessons, but it doesn't show up in the documents in the sense that I've never actually seen a report that goes over it in detail. But I'm absolutely positive that they would have been aware of it due to the very strong connections between the Rangers and the Commandos.
I mean, that came up yesterday that between the two nations, there was in this area special forces, which wasn't the term we used then, a lot of cooperation with the British and Americans, perhaps differing in other branches and, air support and things like that. But with the Commandos, Rangers, there's a lot of kind of shared ideas and transfer of personnel back and forth and liaison. So I'm sure these ideas kind of filter through somehow, but we'll move on to the next slide.
The other point that I'd make, and I sort of hinted at this a moment ago, the lessons from the Mediterranean suggested that special operations alone, commando raids alone, were simply too risky. At both Dieppe and during Operation Torch, it was clear that when you only used special operations forces, sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't. So if you needed to guarantee that the raid would succeed, you needed more than just the Commandos or Rangers. You needed something else, and that was naval firepower and bombardment. Now, another critical point, and one that's oftentimes missed about Pointe du Hoc, is commando operations typically arrive too late to prevent attacks by enemy coastal guns on the transport areas. And what I mean by the transport areas is when an amphibious operation is launched, the large transport ships have to unload the infantry troops, the assault troops, into landing craft, into Higgins boats or LCAs, whatever is being used for the amphibious operation. At this particular moment, the naval forces are extremely vulnerable because the large transport ships are basically just idling off the shore, and they're lowering the troops down into the boats or into the landing craft. So they're very, very vulnerable to coastal guns. Now, the problem is that the commando operations, although they sometimes take place before the main assault, they usually take so long that they're really not available to deal with this threat to the transport areas. To do that, you need something that's going to hit the coastal batteries first, and what that is air attack. Once again, to reiterate the point from the Med, air and naval firepower can suppress temporarily the coastal gun batteries, but not permanently. So you use air and naval firepower to temporarily suppress the guns, then you use the Commandos and the Rangers to deal with the guns to cover a longer period, 6 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours. Now, the problem, of course, is that the Allies don't have an infinite number of special operations forces for D-Day. And so they decide that they're going to direct the special operations against the two worst threats. And the two that were selected for D-Day were Pointe du Hoc and Merville. Obviously, we're going to do with Pointe du Hoc. Viewers, especially British viewers, will know Merville. It was a German battery located within range of Sword Beach. And there was considerable concern about that battery. It could strike targets around the Orne River area. It could strike targets in the Sword Beach area. And it was dealt with by an airborne assault. So that was one of the only two major special operations that were selected for D-Day. And this is an illustration. This is from an Allied map to further reiterate the point, and also to point out why Pointe du Hoc was selected as one of these two critical targets. You'll see on the coast, Pointe du Hoc, down sort of in the lower center. It's near Charlie Beach, between Utah and Omaha Beach. And the critical areas that are of so great a concern to the navies are the transport areas. So you can see almost in the center the Utah Beach transport area, and then slightly over to the right, the Omaha transport area. Now, those semicircles that are emanating from the coast are the outer ranges of the German coastal batteries. And if you look very, very carefully, you can see Pointe du Hoc. And you can see that the Pointe du Hoc battery is the only one that covers both transport areas. And that is the reason that Pointe du Hoc was selected for this mission. There were other German gun batteries that were considered to be a significant threat, especially over towards Utah Beach. But they could only hit one transport area, namely the Utah Beach transport area. Pointe du Hoc was a significant target and viewed as a particular threat because it could hit both transport areas. And that's why it was selected for D-Day. So if we can jump to the next one. The whole issue of the Ranger mission has not been well understood because there was never a study, or at least I've never found a study, where anybody went back and actually looked at the evolution of the Ranger plan. And so I had to dig through a lot of the archives down at NARA, down at the National Archives in College Park, to try to determine how the plan evolved. Everybody knows the final plan, which is shown here in the lower right as the May 1944 plan. But in fact, that was the fourth iteration of the major plans that began in February 1944. Rudder and the other command elements of 2nd and 5th Ranger were first told about the Pointe du Hoc mission in late January 1944. But at that stage, they had not been cleared. They didn't get their bigot clearance, meaning that they didn't have access to all of the details about the mission. And that doesn't start to happen until February, March 1944. So the early plan, the February 1944 plan that I show here in the upper left, is actually the plan that was originally drawn up by General Giroux, who was the commander of 5 Corps, 5 Corps being the corps that's responsible for the Omaha Beach mission. And Pointe du Hoc, of course, is part of the overall Omaha Beach mission. Giroux suggested that there would be two likely options for attacking Pointe du Hoc. Option number one was to go across the area near Grand Camp, to land on the around the port of Grand Camp. The idea being that that was not protected as well by cliffs, and therefore the forces could get on land without having to worry so much about the cliff problems. The second option was a very similar mission, and that would have been to land in the Vierville Draw area, which of course is one of the main areas at Omaha Beach on D-Day. And same reason, Vierville is not as heavily covered by cliffs, and so the two Ranger battalions could land there and then march inland. Now, there's two obvious problems with this early plan. Number one, option number one, going in near Grand Camp, that area has a lot of shallow reefs and other obstructions in the water. The Royal Navy was not at all happy with that idea. Depending on tidal conditions, those offshore obstacles present a problem. So that was ruled out pretty early on. And then, of course, the second problem, and actually the greater problem, is these landing sites are located 3 or 4 miles away from Pointe du Hoc. And so the problem is you go and land these forces, and they're going to be landed after the preliminary air and naval bombardment. So we're talking 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning at the earliest. But the problem is if the Rangers have to march for several miles, for 3 or 4 miles, and face German defenses, the chances are they're not going to arrive at Pointe du Hoc until, if they're lucky, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning, by which time it's too late. The guns at Pointe du Hoc, if they have not been suppressed by the naval and air bombardment, will be able to fire. And so it becomes clearly evident that these long marches from whether it's Vierville or Grand Camp are really not a good idea. So the next plan, which is actually done by Rudder in the Commando headquarters, is to land them in closer. And this is based on this notion that it really doesn't make sense to go marching in 4 or 5 miles away from Pointe du Hoc. And so that's shown in the lower left-hand side. But once again, this has more or less the same problem. And in fact, it's complicated by the fact that if you move the landing sites in closer to Pointe du Hoc, you start having the problem with the cliffs. So here you have two issues. You have to climb the cliffs, and number two, then you have to march, in this case, more closer to 2 miles in. But still, a 2-mile march through German defenses is going to simply take too long a time. So by April, new thoughts are emerging. And this is actually when they finally say, okay, we're simply going to go up the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc because aerial reconnaissance has shown very clearly that the Germans don't have strong defenses facing the sea. The defense at Pointe du Hoc are mostly towards the south, towards the road network, and in that direction, there's very weak defense towards the sea. Now, this may sound pretty outlandish, and everyone's always made the point, oh, this whole idea that you just go climbing up the cliffs, that's absolutely crazy. But if you go back and look at commando operations in the Mediterranean, and for that matter at Dieppe, the commandos had done this repeatedly. The Dieppe raid involved cliff climbing. Several other major commando operations involved cliff climbing. So this is not something new. I put up this particular picture in order to show something that may seem familiar. If any of the viewers saw the last program I did with you on Pointe du Hoc from the German perspective, this will look very familiar to anyone as the fire control bunker at Pointe du Hoc. This is not the fire control bunker at Pointe du Hoc. This is the fire control bunker at Dieppe. And this was one of the, this is similar to the kind of targets that had to be attacked by the commandos at Dieppe. So if we can jump back to the previous map.
Worth mentioning, Steve, that Dieppe, of course, was pretty much a disaster, but actually the commando operations were the only bits that came close to success. So,
right. So one of the two commando operations did completely succeed. The commandos got up the cliffs, they attacked the battery, they destroyed the battery. The second of the missions failed, but it had nothing to do with the commandos. What happened is that the naval landing force that was bringing the commandos in ran into a German coastal convoy. And the German coastal convoy had several gun-armed ships, and they basically shot up the incoming commando formation. And so the commandos landed late, and they didn't have all of the equipment that they had expected to have. So, yeah, Dieppe is a mixed picture. It's not a failure from the commando perspective, not the overall perspective. But from the commando perspective, one of the two commando raids actually did succeed, and the other one was a failure, not because of the commandos, but because of the problems with the landing force.
So two questions, one from me and one from a viewer. The one from me is, it's been said, I've heard it said at Pointe du Hoc, I probably said it myself, that an airborne attack was dismissed because of the southward facing defenses. But in the archives, is there evidence that an airborne attack was even considered? And if it would be considered, who the hell would do it?
Yes, in fact, there was an airborne attack considered. And when we go back to the maps, that lower left map, the March plan. The March plan, well, actually, I take it back. As early as the February 1944 plan, there was a plan to drop a platoon of airborne forces right on top or very close to Pointe du Hoc. It probably would have been in the town of Saint-Pierre-du-Mont. The idea being that they would kind of fix the German defenses and then the Ranger battalions would march in. This was rejected both in the February or after the February and March plans. The main reason being that a platoon just wasn't viewed as being strong enough. And it's precisely for that reason. The German defenses are facing south. If you drop a platoon of airborne forces there, that's just not enough to overcome the type of defenses that the Germans had. I've never seen any indication that they ever considered anything larger than a platoon size, meaning 35, 40 men being dropped at Pointe du Hoc. I've never seen anything that suggested a battalion or some more significant force. Maybe there's something out there, but a lot of these discussions were not well documented because of the secrecy attached to this mission. They're not like some of the other plans, which go through multiple iterations where there's a long paper trail. These special operations were just so secret that a lot of the stuff is not well documented.
Another question is from Gary, a viewer, and it's a more general one. Was the threat of German coastal batteries perhaps overblown?
I would argue yes, and I argue that in the book. I also point out that the U.S. Marine Corps did a study in the 1970s about the threat of coastal guns, and they specifically described German coastal gun batteries as a paper tiger. But I'd have to back off and say that's on the condition that people understand that by 1944, by D-Day, the Allies have a very good idea how to deal with coastal guns. And Gary should take a look, if he hasn't already seen it, on our previous episode on the German perspective on Pointe du Hoc. The point is that if you left the coastal guns alone, they could have done a lot of damage. But by June 1944, the Allies knew how to deal with them. And so you have Operation Flash Lamp, the major bomber command, RAF bomber command, attacks on the coastal batteries, which are very successful in suppressing the guns. And then it's followed up by very, very heavy naval gunfire. That has to be kept in mind with the Ranger mission. There was an awful lot of firepower directed against Pointe du Hoc before the first Ranger put foot on the Pointe du Hoc promontory. So I would argue the German coastal guns are only a paper tiger if you ignore the Allied efforts to suppress them using naval and air firepower.
And Crisbeck came up in the comments as being the kind of
and Crisbeck is a good example of what happens when you don't use the Rangers. And I would actually say that there's two instances. What happens if you just use air power and naval power to attack these batteries, but you don't use a Ranger force? And the two examples are Crisbeck and Longstad-Meade. And so any of the viewers who have visited Normandy have probably gone over to Longstad-Meade, because it's one of those batteries that still has its guns, very scenic. It's a great place to visit. Well, what happened at both of those batteries is they got bombed very, very heavily by Operation Flash Lamp starting around 3 o'clock on D-Day morning. And then they got naval gunfire afterwards from about 5 o'clock, 5:30 through dawn on D-Day. And yet the Germans managed to recover both batteries, and both batteries fired on the Allied landing force. The Crisbeck battery may have actually been the only German battery to sink an Allied warship. The destroyer USS Corey was sunk during an engagement with the Crisbeck battery, although there's an enormous amount of controversy over whether it was sunk. It was certainly hit by the Crisbeck battery, but whether it was sunk is another matter, because a later U.S. Navy report says, no, it was a naval mine, that when the Corey was engaging with Crisbeck, it ran over a naval mine and blew it in half and sank it.
Yeah.
The battery at Longstad-Meade never hits anything, but it disrupts some British Royal Navy command ships, and it starts firing at Omaha Beach, and a French cruiser comes in and blasts it for the final time late on D-Day. So those two batteries, Longstad-Meade and Crisbeck, shows what happens when you have a coastal battery and you don't land commandos or Rangers to deal with it.
And worth mentioning that both of those locations were, this is a rabbit hole we're going down, both close enough to have had paratroopers assigned to take them out as well. I mean, because Crisbeck isn't that far away from the 502nd drop zone, and Longstad-Meade is within where 47 Royal Marine Commando are going. So they could have been given some attention that they weren't. I mean, that's another big rabbit hole for another. That would be things that should have been planned for D-Day that weren't. Like the fact that Hillman was never a naval target was like a bombshell when we found out that a couple of years ago. That was never on the list of targets to bombard. That was like, what, Hillman? Anyway, but
that's an important point. And I think that one of the things that's not very clear, and this comes right to the heart of Pointe du Hoc. One of the reasons that Pointe du Hoc features in on the Allied planning right from the get-go, from summer of 1943 on, is that Pointe du Hoc is sitting there, as we discussed in the last episode. It's been sitting there since 1942. So the Allies are very familiar with it. Longstreet Mad doesn't start construction until roughly February, March 1944. And so Longstreet Mad is not high up on the list. Longstreet Mad should have been high on the list. It was the only German naval coastal gun battery versus Army coastal gun battery in the Normandy beach area. So it theoretically should have had really, really great fire controls and all sorts of other bits. It ended up not having it because construction started so late that it never got all of its fire control stuff. But Longstreet Mad should have been the most dangerous coastal battery in Normandy. But as I say, it doesn't start construction until well into the D-Day planning cycle. And there's a lot of inertia in that planning cycle. So targets that get picked out early, like Pointe du Hoc and Merville, tend to get a lot of attention. But batteries that suddenly appear late in the planning cycle, meaning spring of 1944, they get less attention. So I would certainly argue Longstreet Mad deserved more attention. It didn't get it because it was constructed so late. Crispec should have gotten more attention. It didn't get the attention largely because it could only attack the Utah area. And of course, Utah planning is the last of the major beaches to receive planning because it was added last. And so the inertia in the planning process has something to do with this.
Meanwhile, back to the cliffs. And
no, if we can go back to that map, because I want to show a couple things. Yeah, here we go. The April map is the first time that there's the cliff climbing. But the important thing to see is that right from the get-go, the Ranger mission, the 2-battalion Ranger mission, is not only Pointe du Hoc. The second part of the mission is a small company-sized formation here called Force X. That is going to attack the gun positions on the cliffs at Pointe de la Percée, which faces Omaha Beach. There had been, right from the outset, a lot of concern about whether these gun batteries that are on the Pointe de la Percée, whether they could fire an enfilade along Omaha Beach. So those guns are added into the Ranger mission in April 1944. That's the target that's attacked by Gorenson's company on D-Day. And then the final evolution in May 1944 is to change the mission of Force Y, which later becomes Force C. That, of course, is 5th Rangers and 2 companies from 2nd Rangers. The original plan had them landing at Vierville and then marching all the way from Vierville all the way over to Pointe du Hoc. And like the early February March plans, everybody realized, it's not a great idea because it's going to take them forever to get there. So instead, the critical change is Force A, which is roughly 2.5 companies, is going to land at Pointe du Hoc. That's Rudder's group, although Rudder originally isn't supposed to command it. And then if they succeed, if Force A lands and succeeds, Force C will land right behind them. So that would have put almost all of the Ranger force minus 1 company at Pointe du Hoc. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about why that doesn't happen. But that was the ideal picture. The ideal picture is Force A lands, and then it succeeds immediately, and Force C lands right behind it. So you have almost 2 complete Ranger battalions at Pointe du Hoc. They rename Force X as Force B. Once again, that's Gorenson's single company, which goes for the other gun batteries, the Pointe de la Percée gun batteries.
I hate to mention this, Steve, but Robert Baker, we can blame him, is asking, am I right in thinking that Maisy battery wasn't seen as a major threat?
No, it was completely disregarded. I know that that's become a big controversy now, but the Maisy battery, you have to understand, is a divisional artillery battery. It's not a coastal gun battery. Coastal gun batteries have fire control bunkers that can fire out at naval targets. So Pointe du Hoc has a fire control bunker. Longstreet Mad does. Crispec does. The 2 Maisy batteries don't. They're simply they're divisional batteries of the 716th Infantry Division, and so they're just regarded as other infantry divisions. They are bombed. Of the 2 batteries, one of them was receiving gun casemates, so that one was singled out to be bombed. So that is bombed, in fact, quite heavily by Operation Flash Lamp in the early morning hours of D-Day. An almost completely ineffective mission. There was a lot of cloud cover, and so it didn't get hit particularly badly. But no, that Maisy doesn't figure in the planning.
Cool.
Yeah, and if we can just, let's jump ahead one more. Once again, cliff scaling is not something peculiar to the Ranger mission. I think especially in the United States, everybody seems to think, Pointe du Hoc is just some really wild, super dangerous mission. But once again, the commandos had done this repeatedly, and the Rangers benefit enormously from this. Practically all of the gear that was developed by the British commandos for their own missions prior to D-Day. And furthermore, the Rangers were taught by the commandos. They received all of their training in the UK with commando officers, and it was based on earlier commando lessons. What we're seeing here are two things. One of the methods of getting up the cliffs was to use ropes that were fired using rocket projectors, and I'll show that in more detail in a moment. And also the commandos had designed these special lightweight ladders. They came in 6-foot sections. You could stick a whole bunch of 6-foot sections together and you could create a ladder. The advantage of the ladder over the ropes is that they're simply easier to climb. So here you see a pre-D-Day exercise on the British coast of the 2nd Ranger Battalion using these British techniques. And if we can jump to the next one. This is what's called a J projector. This was a British invention. It used a type of rocket device which had already been designed for firing rockets. It was used for coastal rescue missions. For example, if a small craft gets caught up on reefs offshore and you wanted to throw a rope out to the survivors to haul them ashore, that's where this idea came from. In the case of the commandos, they took a look at that idea and said, well, we're going to take this one stage further. We're going to tie a rope to it, but we're also going to put grapple hooks up at the top of it. And so you fire this J projector, and the rockets will drag the rope behind it up to the top of the cliffs, and thereby put the ropes on top of the cliffs, and thereby speed the whole process, enable you to climb up the cliffs. And they had different types of ropes. They had a plain rope, they had a rope with knots in it, and they had a rope with little toggle bolts. And so if we can jump to the next slide. This led to a top secret program called Project Scam. This took LCA landing craft, and it mounted 6 J projectors on each LCA. And the 3 boxes contained different types of ropes. So the aft one contained plain rope. The middle one was ropes with toggles, ropes with knots. And then the forward one was the ropes with toggles. And so a number of these Project Scam LCAs were built specifically for the main force, Force A, going into Pointe du Hoc. And this is the method that they're going to be using to get the ropes up on top of the cliffs as quickly as possible.
Well, I think I'm glad you're covering this, because I think over the years, because of this Ranger legacy we talked about, there's come to be this kind of idea that it was just kind of brute force and daring do that got the Rangers up the cliffs. And actually, as you said at the beginning, it is a combined arms. They are using tech, they are using gear, they are using background. It wasn't just a question of throwing in tough guys and hoping for the best. It is a well-planned, okay, as we'll find out, some of these bits don't always work perfectly, but they are giving these things what I would call force multipliers.
Oh, it is very much so. I can't reemphasize the point enough. This was based on a legacy of commando operations along the French and Norwegian coast. And so, once again, I think that from the American perspective, a lot of people forget this strong connection between the Rangers and the commandos. And the reason that the mission did go as successfully as it did is specifically because the Rangers were just so well prepared. And I don't think I'm going to deal with it in any detail today, but everybody seems to view, probably because of the movie Longest Day, that the Rangers faced all sorts of German opposition when they were scaling the cliffs. And in fact, that wasn't the case. The German resistance on the cliff was very, very relatively light. I mean, obviously, it's no fun climbing up cliffs when people are shooting at you. But these devices that were used, the scaling ropes and other techniques, enabled the Rangers to get up very, very quickly and suffer very modest casualties. The best I can see from the surviving records is that the Rangers suffered 15 casualties during the cliff phase. And of that, I'm not even sure anyone was killed. And if they were killed, it may have been from falling off the cliffs rather than from German gunfire. But it was not an especially costly aspect of the Ranger mission. The Rangers are going to suffer a lot of casualties, but it's not going to be the cliff climbing. It's going to be once they get up on top of the cliffs and fight the German defenders on top of Pointe du Hoc.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, we're going down a rabbit, and we can discuss this later on. But that memorial that lists the names that you find inside the fire control point I think people who don't have the knowledge look at those names and think, because the cliffs are just in front of them, oh, those poor guys must have died on the cliffs. Whereas, as we know, the majority of them died in the counterattacks between the 6th and the 7th in the morning of the 7th.
Yes.
But I think, again, the longest day perception is Germans on the cliff tops, grenades over the edges, machine gun, and this deadly assault there that really didn't happen. As you said there, that the equipment and the speed was perfect, which is bringing us to the ladders, because someone's already asked, are we going to do the ladders? And we are.
Yeah, well, this was an innovation. This is a Commando design. It was never used by the Commandos, but the Commandos were working on it before D-Day. And, once they saw what the Ranger mission is, they say, hey, do you folks want to use this? And so 4 of these were built. This consists of a DUKW amphibious truck with a type of ladder that was used by the London Fire Brigade. That's where the idea came from. People saw the telescoping ladders that were used by the London Fire Brigade and said, hey, that'd be a great idea. We'll go and stick these telescoping ladders on top of a duck, and therefore we'll bring this thing along with us, and then the Rangers will just have to run right up the ladder. So this seems like a really great idea. And if we go to the next one, we can see actual pictures. That's what it looks like in the water. And probably the most curious feature, which is, I think, in the next picture or the next one after, is, well, this shows the ladder erected. So you can see how efficient this would have been had it worked properly. You put the ladder up, you can get right to the top of the cliffs, boom, everybody just races up the cliffs. And the cool feature, or the unique feature about this, I think, is in the next picture. And that is that at the top of the ladder are 3 Vickers K-gun machine guns. So the idea being that you'd have somebody get at the top of the ladder and then it'd be elevated. And then as the ladder is elevated, the guy up at the top, the Ranger up at the top, would have 3 machine guns to spray the top of the cliffs to shoot away any German defenders. Now, not to extend the melodrama too far, this doesn't happen. I think everybody knows the ladders never show up. There were 2 reasons for it. Number one, because of the communication snafu, or the navigation snafu rather. 2 of the swans, the ducks with the ladders, one gets sunk and one gets heavily damaged, and that's because they had to travel such a long distance from where they were dumped off the LCTs all the way over to Pointe du Hoc, and the others take on a lot of water. And the second problem is, when they finally do get to Pointe du Hoc had been heavily bombarded prior to the arrival of the Rangers. And so if you've ever seen pictures from Pointe du Hoc on the morning of, there's craters all along the beach. And so when the ducks get there, they try to get up on the shore, but it's all cratered. This is the actual section of the beach at Pointe du Hoc. Well, this is a reasonably recent picture, but if you can imagine all that beach just being full of big bomb craters. And so the swan duck concept just never works.
And worth again mentioning that it must have been the British influence that had them choose the Vickers K-gun, because it's that ideal weapon, not particularly heavy. Because I read in original accounts people saying Lewis guns, and I always thought that's ridiculously heavy. And the Vickers K, it's not, you don't have you're not going to take loads of spare magazines up with you, but it's light-ish, a lot of firepower quickly. Ideal for this, and that clearly has to be the British influence there, because Vickers K's wouldn't have come into American thinking without someone saying, hey, we've got this old aircraft gun, it might be ideal for this.
Oh yeah, the swan ducks are British Commando design. They're not a US design. The other interesting thing about the Vickers K guns also is that the Rangers end up using them during the fighting for Pointe du Hoc. In fact, there's a very well-known picture. I don't have it in this.
It came up yesterday, the photo with the upturned helmet.
Yeah, so with the upturned helmet, the temporary Ranger memorial, and it's a Vickers K gun, and there's a Ranger helmet on top of it. Well, what happened when the ducks weren't able to get the ladders up, they were beached. I mean, they did land at Pointe du Hoc, and basically the crews, including the British, some of the ducks were actually manned by British crews. Everybody got out, they took the Vickers K guns, and then they got up the cliffs using the ropes or the ladders or whatever. And so the duck crews ended up fighting at Pointe du Hoc. In fact, 2 of the British drivers were later decorated for their role, and they were armed with Vickers K guns. So that's a minor little bit of historical trivia for anyone interested in small arms. And this is a scene from, I think it was 2019, the 75th Ranger Regiment staged a reenactment at Pointe du Hoc during one of the anniversary celebrations. I threw this picture in to give people a better sense of what it's like, what the cliffs look like from the ground level. Now, obviously, the Rangers on D-Day didn't have this type of netting style to climb up. They had the ropes and the ladders and things. But this particular memorial was actually conducted where the Rangers actually did climb up on D-Day. And if we can go to the next one. And this is sort of the Ranger perspective / German perspective. This gives you a sense of the height from the top of the cliffs down to the shoreline.
And it was worth mentioning, Joanna said yesterday, I mean, they had trained on cliffs 3 times this height. So, you know.
Oh, yeah.
On the day.
And repeatedly. If you look at any accounts of Ranger training in the UK in the spring of 1944, all they're talking about is cliff climbing.
Yeah.
It was just drummed into their heads. Scaling cliffs, scaling cliffs, scaling cliffs. They did it repeatedly, and they did it literally days before June 6th. They were still doing cliff scaling operations or training.
Yeah. But now we move to the snafu.
Yeah, I mentioned in the planning phase that the original plan was to land both Force A and Force C at Pointe du Hoc, which would have put, as I say, both of the Ranger battalions minus Gorenson's company, all of them would have landed at Pointe du Hoc. Obviously, that doesn't happen. Well, what was the reason? The plan to land included the use of a Royal Navy motor launch 304. That contained navigation aids. It included a radio navigation aid, which used signals emanated from radio stations in Britain that could be used to triangulate the location of the target. And there was also a coastal search radar on board the vessel in order to direct the vessels in towards the coast. Now, what happens at 05:30, sort of in the right around dawn, is that both the radar and the radio navigation beacon both failed. Now, the skipper of ML304 is later blamed for that, but I'm not going to cast aspersions about that. It's not really clear why they failed, but in any event, they failed. Now, at that point, the snafu occurs. The skipper of ML304 starts to look at the scenery and mistakes Pointe du Hoc, the target of Gorenson's Force B. He thinks that that's Pointe du Hoc. And so he starts to aim the flotilla, meaning the motor launch, the 2 gunboats, the Swan ducks, and all of the LCAs. They start heading to Pointe du Hoc, which is about 3 miles to the east of Pointe du Hoc. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is, first of all, the coast looks an awful lot alike. Anybody who's been over to Normandy and you look at the cliffs stretching roughly from Vierville over towards Pointe du Hoc, the cliffs look very, very similar. So you can understand why somebody would make a mistake. Then, of course, on top of that, there was an enormous amount of smoke and fog due to all the bombing, the weather conditions, and all that. And the error isn't realized until about 0600. Colonel Rudder, who's leading Force A, becomes convinced that they're heading towards the wrong target, and he talks to the Royal Navy people on the LCAs, and so they finally redirect it. But the problem is when they start to change the direction, roughly at 0615, 0630, they're 3 miles away from Pointe du Hoc. Now, they're supposed to be landing at 0630. So they come in late. They land about 40 minutes late. Force A, meaning Rudder's force, lands at 0708, according to the deck logs of the accompanying warships. So they're about 40 minutes late. Now, as I mentioned before, the option for Force C, meaning the rest of the Rangers, was that they had to get a radio signal as soon as possible saying, we've landed, we've reached the top of the cliffs. If Rudder's force had sent them a radio message and said, we've landed successfully, we're at the top of the cliffs, in that case, Force C, the bulk of the Ranger force, would have followed behind them and landed at Pointe du Hoc. That does not happen. The force doesn't land until 0708. Then on top of that, none of the radios work. And so Schneider, who's heading the rest of the Ranger force, he makes a decision roughly at 7:15. He says, okay, it does not appear that they've landed successfully, or if they have, we haven't heard from them. So they head for Vierville Draw, which is option B. Now, here's a very nice aerial view. Pointe du Hoc is slightly to the left. It's that sort of where that corner is, where that sharp corner occurs. That at that corner, there were 2 German gun batteries. Those are the target of Görance's Force B. Pointe du Hoc is located, you can't see it in this picture. It would be over to the far right. It's another short distance over to the far right. So you can sort of understand why the skipper of ML304 had problems identifying it. Pointe du Hoc does kind of stick out visually, and that was one of the reasons why he made the mistake.
A group of us did a boat trip last summer from Grand Maisy, Carenton to Pointe du Hoc. And yes, when you're coming in from near the beach, the pointy bit at the front is really very obvious. But as soon as you go in front of it and you're looking back at the cliffs, all of that close, that you don't see the distinctive region. It just looks like cliffs. So when I was there, I completely understood. If you're a couple of miles away and it's smoky and foggy, it's really difficult to work out what is what.
Yeah, so it wasn't a big surprise. And I'll make the argument in a moment that it probably worked out better for the U.S. landings at Omaha Beach anyways. Rudder's force was able to capture Pointe du Hoc. They were able to hold on control of the guns. The mission succeeded. I mean, even though they didn't have as large a force as they might have, their essential mission, which was to seize the guns and keep them from firing, that succeeded. So it didn't really matter whether the remainder of the Ranger force landed. So the remainder of their landing force lands over at Vierville Draw. Now, the importance of that is that this is a long, complicated story, but for anyone familiar with the story of Omaha Beach, and especially Vierville Draw is where one of the massacres occurs, where Company A of the 116th Infantry basically gets slaughtered. They're the initial assault wave landing at Dog Green Beach. They land right in the face of 2 major German strong points. They simply get chopped to shreds. The follow-on waves of 116th don't suffer as intense a series of casualties, but they still suffer very, very heavy casualties. Now, one of the good things is, or one of the fortunate things from the standpoint of Force C is, they're coming in 15, 20 minutes after Company A lands. And so they can see that Company A is just getting massacred right in front of WN72 and WN71. So if we can jump to the next map, this shows where the different LCAs land. You can see A116th, they're the first wave that comes ashore right in the face of those German defenses. Force B is Görance's force landing to try to take out Pointe du Hoc de la Percée. I'm going to ignore that for the moment. But the major part of the force, Force C, which we see over to the right, they land well to the east of Vierville Draw. And as you can see, they tended to land away from the worst of the German defenses. W170 is far less effective as a defense nest than W172 and W171. And so the vast bulk of 4C gets ashore with fairly light casualties. And so that puts about 2.5 Ranger battalions ashore right after 116th Infantry takes very, very heavy losses. And so you have this very, very well-trained force, which serves as an immediate source of reinforcements for the 116th at a very, very critical moment. Now, the interesting thing is, and we can go to the next picture, and this will be evident to anyone who's been to Normandy, they land in an area which doesn't have cliffs. It's more just a very, very steep hill. Where they land is roughly in the center of this photo. And it's very, very steep. And I think the next picture probably shows a little bit. This is a contemporary picture. I think I took it in 2014 or 15. That steep area there is where they went up, where 4C goes up on D-Day. Now, those houses have been built since the war. At the time of the war, those buildings weren't there, or there were ruins. But you can see how steep it is. So it was difficult climbing, but of course it was climbing against rather modest German defenses. So 4C gets up on top of the elevation with very, very modest casualties, and as a result, they have an intact force of very, very well-trained elite infantry. And so they make a big deal of difference in the defense of Vierville Draw over the next 2 days. And if we can go to the next slide, what happens on D-Day itself is, of course, the 4C is subordinate to 116th Infantry. And so 116th Infantry, when Schneider, the head of 4C, says, well, I'm gonna march our troops over to Pointe du Hoc. 116th says, no, you're not. You're going to stay here in the Vierville draw because we're badly depleted from our casualties earlier on D-Day, and you're going to help defend the town of Vierville. And so on the remainder of D-Day, Ranger Force C is an essential portion of the defense of the western shoulder of Omaha Beach at the Vierville draw. On D+1, the task force of the Rangers plus the 1st Battalion of 116th starts to head to Pointe du Hoc. Now, at the moment that they start doing that, or within about 15, 20 minutes, a comp group of the German Grenadier Regiment 916th hits Vierville draw again. This is the largest counterattack on the Omaha Beach sector on D+1. Well, guess what happens? 116th Infantry tells the Rangers to hold back, and so several companies of Rangers are kept in Vierville for D+1 to help defend the beachhead. So for that reason, the presence of Ranger Force C, 5th Ranger Battalion, and a good chunk of 2nd Ranger, very essential for the defense of Omaha Beach. And it's an aspect of the Ranger mission that's oftentimes forgotten. Yeah. Pointe du Hoc obviously takes over most of the attention, but the mission of Force C is very significant in the broader picture of the history of Omaha Beach.
I mean, I think that's a very good point, Steve, because, we'll get to it in a minute, that yes, the casualties were high at Pointe du Hoc, but as you said, and you've said repeatedly, they did achieve their mission. They did find the guns inland. We all know that story. They did manage to pretty much hold that section of road there. And had 4C ended up going to Pointe du Hoc, are they going to make a significant difference there?
And that's exactly the point. Let's just do a counterfactual. Yeah. Let's just pretend that Schneider and 4C do land at Pointe du Hoc. What difference does it make? It means that, yeah, okay, they would have been able to push down south of the road perhaps a little bit sooner. But in reality, you still only have less than 2 battalions of light infantry without any significant support weapons except for Navy gunfire. What would they have accomplished? And the answer is, yeah, I mean, it would have made it easier at Pointe du Hoc. There probably would have been fewer Ranger casualties. But I think you can very clearly see that the presence of Ranger Force C down at Omaha Beach, where the beachhead was threatened, is much more significant for the American operation at Omaha Beach than just some additional Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. The Pointe du Hoc mission succeeds. No more forces were really needed to do the main objective, which was to keep the guns suppressed, whereas Ranger Force C at Vierville draw is very significant. It makes a big difference in the defense of Vierville.
And definitely worth mentioning as well that even the latter waves on Omaha Beach tended to go further east because things got better near Videstondes 70 and even further down towards Les Moulins. So there is a real thin force at Vierville-sur-Mer come the end of June the 6th, morning of the 7th, because of, as you said earlier, the horrendous losses A Company sustained and even B Company coming in. We're not that fewer casualties there. So that force of Rangers there, because what does Cota lead off the beach? About 130 men or something?
Yeah, so it's a very, very small force.
Of firepower.
And the important thing to remember, too, is that the original plan, the original 29th Division and 1st Division plan was that 115th Infantry, the follow-on regiment, they were supposed to head west towards Pointe du Hoc and towards Isigny and Grand Camp. And they don't. They're redirected and they head east because of the nature of the fighting on D-Day. And so instead of having the badly depleted 116th reinforced by 115th, 115th heads east. They do not head west. They do not stay in the Vierville area. And the 3rd Regiment from the 29th Division, the 175th, they don't arrive until D+1. And so they don't play a role in that early defense of Vierville, whereas the Rangers do.
Well, brilliant stuff. That was our last image. Any more questions from the viewers? I mean, I've got some things to learn. I mean, we're going back to us as well, going back to this idea of Pointe du Hoc. I mean, we said at the beginning it's time for a fresh evaluation, and I think there are things we can still look at about rudder at Pointe du Hoc and be objective about things. And I have to say I question a little bit some of the patrolling inland from the road. Once they know the reinforcements aren't coming, once they've already got to realize there's a little bit of a wasp nest they've poked inland of Germans moving in, I do question why at that point they don't just kind of stick near the road they've got and kind of hold what they got. What's your thought about some of the patrolling inland that day?
The reason is that they thought they were going to be reinforced within a few hours. They knew that 4C hadn't landed behind them, and so the plan was that 4C was supposed to follow up on the land route from Vierville up to Pointe du Hoc. Now, the plan was, if you look at the plan, 4C was supposed to arrive at Pointe du Hoc around noontime on D-Day. So one of the reasons that they start probing out there and start putting up defenses, basically to create essentially like a little beachhead around the road, is that they're expecting at any moment, roughly by noon, that 4C would be walking up the road. And of course, that doesn't happen. Now, we've described already why it didn't happen, because Germans counterattack at Vierville and 4C gets held behind to do the defense. But the Rangers continue to think through D-Day that that's going to happen. One of the other bits of news, which I'm sure most people are aware of, is there is a single element of 5th Rangers headed by Lieutenant Parker, which actually does get from Omaha Beach, and they go inland and they get all the way to Pointe du Hoc. So Parker from 5th Rangers brings a group of men, about 35, 40 men, up to Pointe du Hoc. So these guys arrive. So everybody's thinking, well, at any moment now, we're going to get reinforced. We'll have 2 battalions. And I think that that's the main reason that they kept poking further south away from Pointe du Hoc, is that they were expecting any moment they were going to be reinforced. And as long as they're going to be reinforced, try a slightly more adventurous approach. And of course, the German attacks early on D-Day, up through like noon, early afternoon, are not very dedicated. They're fairly weak. They're fairly confused. It's the attacks that occur in the evening once Grenadier Regiment 914 starts sending real units in. The early morning attacks are mostly hodgepodge units that were up in the area. The real attacks start on the evening of D-Day, or the night of. Actually, the main attacks come at night. So it's, after 10 o'clock on D plus D+1.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Robert Bake. He asked this earlier on, and I said, can you leave it till the end there? So he says, do you think things are clearer as to what actually happened and why some Rangers accounts might have been written to defend their actions? I think he's probably referring also to the fact that the small unit action report kind of got shortened. There's like the 95-page original version. There's like the 75-page version written at the end of the war. And I think maybe this is connecting with the idea of Maisy battery, the revisionist view of that. So, again, so do you think that we are clear now about what happened?
No, I have the original small unit action is the original official U.S. account of the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. It was published in a separate publication from the Omaha Beach study and from the Green Book account of Omaha Beach. It's available at National Archives in the combat interview section of Record Group 407. There's multiple versions of it. I have at least 3 different versions of it. The reason why it's a significant account, and I'm not talking small unit action, I'm talking the original manuscript.
Yeah.
The manuscript is the unedited version, and it has a lot of annotations on the side where the Army historians, I should back up for a minute and explain what this stuff is. The U.S. Army Historical Branch sent historians in with all major combat units. And after significant battles, the historians went around and interviewed surviving participants of the battle. So the Army historical people went in the days after D-Day and interviewed surviving Rangers regarding what had happened at Pointe du Hoc. And so that's what this combat interview stuff is. It's a digested set of interviews. And then it was turned into a more polished manuscript that becomes small unit action. So the raw one is what's in combat interviews. And it's interesting because there's a lot of questions that some of the historians sent back to the historians in theater and said, hey, if you get a chance, go and talk to the Rangers and ask them questions about this point and that point, which isn't very clear. Somebody said this, but somebody else said that. So I'll give you an example. One of the controversies is who found the guns and who destroyed the guns. Now, we know who found the guns. There's Len Lommel and his buddy, the 2 guys who went out, found them. The controversy is only, what did they actually do when they got there? They didn't have enough thermite grenades. They didn't put them in the barrel. They put them, from what Len Lommel says, he put them on the gun sites. In any event, but they did find the guns. And then a few minutes later, another patrol from another company headed by Sergeant Rapinski, they come along. There's a much bigger patrol. They had a lot of thermite grenades. They put thermite grenades in each barrel. So they destroyed all 5 guns, and they set the ammunition on fire. So The second patrol wiped out the German guns. The first patrol found them, damaged all the guns. Second patrol wiped them out. The problem is Rapinski gets captured on D-Day night in those German counterattacks. He was not there to interview. Len Lommel was. Len Lommel gives his first account. But in later years, Len Lommel's account of what happened expands and expands and expands, and he makes it sound like it was just him and his buddy who dealt with the guns. Whereas you can see from the Army interviews that it was actually two groups. It was Lommel's first group, which discovers the guns, and then Rapinski's group, which goes in and damages the gun severely and destroys most of the ammunition. So it's a bunch of little points like that. I don't think that there's really any shocking news in the combat interviews. They're very, very useful to flesh out some detail, but I don't think there's any shockers in there. As I say, I've had them for a number of years, and I've got multiple editions. But I don't. If people are thinking there's some smoking gun or some hidden,
well, I think this is partly connected to the idea that Maisy was more important, which is just an idea I don't hold any water to at all. And I'm not going to start casting any dispute against the owner of Maisy Battery, but the people have started to speculate that there's some cover-ups involved at the Pointe du Hoc and men. I'm not. No, I mean, Rapinski, from memory, was F Company, wasn't it? And again,
it was F Company. Yeah, it was F Company. Rapinski comes back to the States. He lives north of me or he did before he died. He lived north of me up in Pennsylvania. He never conducted any interviews, as far as I know. And so he ended up in a prisoner of war camp. So he got stuck at a prisoner of war camp until the end of the war. And he was the exact opposite of Len Lommel. Len Lommel you see any documentary about Pointe du Hoc, you got interviews with him. He talked with everybody. And as you well know, he went over to Normandy very often, very closely associated with the whole Pointe du Hoc story. Rapinski was the polar opposite. He's almost completely unknown. Nobody pays any attention to him. He didn't do any interviews, so he's an unknown factor. As far as Maisy is concerned, if you read the interviews, there's not even a mention of Maisy in the combat interviews. And in Ranger documents in general, there's practically nothing until, of course, the day where they're assigned to take out the batteries. And they attack the batteries and they capture them. But as I mentioned in my book, because I have a chapter devoted to the attack on the Maisy batteries, by then they probably had been abandoned by the German artillery unit. The German artillery unit was instructed the night before the Ranger attack to abandon the unit, to move as many guns as they could, but they were supposed to abandon it. So we're not even sure who was at Maisy the day the Rangers attacked. I think it was an Ost battalion, not the artillery guys. I think the artillery guys by that stage were gone. So yeah, there's mysteries about Maisy, but it's just because the German records especially are very poor. We don't really know what happened from the German perspective. We know what happens from the Ranger perspective. There's very good Ranger accounts of the attack on the Maisy battery. So we do know that in quite a bit of detail.
So I think I asked this in the first show about the German perspective, but from the American perspective, are there any questions that, as far as you're concerned, still remain unanswered about Pointe du Hoc, or are we kind of there and understand it now?
There's a bunch of questions, but at this stage they're getting smaller and smaller, and I would say less significant. One of the questions that I'm still interested in is the whole issue of when did Allied intelligence know that the guns had been moved away from Pointe du Hoc, and was there any deliberation about that? And as you know, because you have the document, the French resistance did inform the Allies by radio by late April that the guns had been moved. The bigger issue is, what was the Allied appreciation? Now, I talked about this in quite a bit of detail in our last session about how the Allies saw repeatedly that Germans had moved guns away from batteries during this whole casemate construction program. So contrary to the popular view that, the guns being moved from Pointe du Hoc was this big significant thing, no, it wasn't. The Allies had seen this happen repeatedly, had nothing to do with why the Pointe du Hoc guns were moved. It had to do with the casemate construction program. They had done this all through Lower Normandy. And so the big issue was, are the guns there? And as I mentioned in the last session, Allied air reconnaissance strongly suggests that the guns were there as of the last mission, which was 31 May 1944. So the Allies did know that the guns had been moved, but they thought that they'd been moved back. And that's basic. But it would be interesting to find if there were some other deliberations, and that nobody's ever found. I haven't been able to find it if there were deliberations at the higher command level saying, what about the guns and the moving and all that stuff. I've never found the deliberations. We know that Rudder was informed that the French had said the guns had been moved, but once again, it comes down to this point: were they there on D-Day? And Allied intelligence thought they were there on D-Day based on photo reconnaissance.
Okay, so the next question, and it's about the next few weeks in Normandy, because it's something that comes up on tour. People say, so what did the Rangers do next? Because when we're talking about most of the assault units on D-Day, and I mean airborne and commandos and the British, that they carry on fighting. They're there at the sharp end for weeks, if not months. But the Rangers kind of don't really get anything for several weeks till they get towards Brittany. So what's your feeling about that? Because there's an obscure monument, I forget where it is, on the western coast, somewhere north of Barneville, Carteret, where the Rangers are over there. And I said, what the hell are they doing over there? This is in middle of July or something. So why did they not get anything else immediately following D-Day?
They were pulled out of the line after they did after they attacked the Maisy battery. They had a mission the next day, which was basically to deal with the German coastal offenses that were up near Grand Camp. And then after that, they're all brought together. Of course, Second Rangers had suffered very, very heavy casualties. They were the folks who were at Pointe du Hoc. And the Second Rangers, the two companies of Second Rangers who were with 4C, the folks who land on Omaha Beach, they took heavy casualties. If you remember that map that I showed a while ago, the folks from Second Rangers landed closer to the Vierville draw. So they landed closer to the German strong points. So Second Rangers as a whole suffered much worse casualties than did Fifth Rangers. So they were pulled out just because they had suffered such heavy casualties. Yeah, if you look at that map sort of towards the right, you can see B Company of Second Rangers, Headquarters Second Rangers, and A Company Second Rangers. You can see that they land much further to the west than does Fifth Rangers. Fifth Rangers is all the way over there on the left, and the various elements of Second Rangers are further to the west, and so they're closer to the German defenses. They land roughly between WN71 and WN70, so they suffer much heavier casualties than Fifth Ranger. Fifth Ranger basically avoids the worst of the German strong points. And the fact that the Rangers are not used in combat afterwards was one of the reasons why there was a considerable amount of controversy in Washington as to how many Ranger battalions should exist. And the head of the Army Forces Command, who had been arguing against having too many of these Ranger battalions, basically argued that the reason he wasn't very much in favor of these type of specialized units is they tended to be used only for specific special operations, and then they tend to be pulled out of the line and then reserved for some other special operation. And he didn't like that. He thought that too many of the first-class troops were being diverted to these type of missions, and he didn't want that done. And as you say, the Rangers don't see a lot of extensive combat until the fighting in Brittany, where they are assigned missions. And quite honestly, if you go and you look at the Ranger record after the campaign in France, the Rangers are used, but they're relatively minor missions. They're not these high visibility type missions. They're used during the Siegfried Line campaign to attack a couple of German strong points, but they sort of disappear from the picture. Rudder's pulled out. Rudder's given the command of a regular infantry regiment. The Rangers sort of disappear. And as you know, in the Italian theater, the 3 Ranger battalions get chopped up very badly at Anzio. I don't want to say the Rangers fall out of favor, but they don't have the same impact as they did in 1943, early 44, when they become a spearhead for amphibious operations. After the big amphibious operations are done with, their whole mission in life sort of disappears.
I guess that's because there's this focus on the airborne, the first Allied Airborne Army in July, August 44. And I guess the need for airborne forces, perhaps they have a more diverse set of things they can do than the Rangers, which, as you said, are kind of connected with amphibious landings. And we've done them now. There are no more. There's some river crossings and there's high ground to take, but that actual focus on amphibious, like Hobart's Funnies of the 79th Armored Division, that kind of have a very brief, really, moment of glory. They are used later on, but the amphibious landings is, of course, their main focus. So my last question really is going to be kind of the legacy of Pointe du Hoc. Is it kind of a burden or a blessing for current serving Rangers? because I think your average ranger serving coming to Normandy today would know quite a lot about Pointe du Hoc, but as you say, perhaps not as much about Italy, perhaps not as much about the towns out there, and certainly not very much about what was happening later in the Siegfried line and kind of that area. So, a blessing or a curse, the Pointe du Hoc being such a huge story?
I think it's largely a blessing. I mean, it's the core legend of the Ranger Force. I mean, you have to accept that that's the case. I mean, the Ranger motto, Rangers lead the way. Well, who does that come from? It's General Coda talking to Force C on Omaha Beach on D-Day. So this is kind of their birth. This is their legacy. This is where the Rangers really start. I think that the controversy really stems from before D-Day, and that was the argument between the Ranger advocates and General Leslie McNair, who headed Army Ground Forces. And McNair was the guy who didn't like the airborne, he didn't like the Rangers, he didn't like special operations in general. He just said it siphons off all the best of the soldiers, the most heroic elements within the infantry, and puts them on these specialized missions, and it degrades the regular infantry. So there was an enormous amount of debate in 1943-44 in the U.S. Army about what the Rangers are. The original conception is that people would receive Ranger training, and then they'd go back to their units and instill the elite Ranger training with the rest of the infantry division. And so you see that happen in one case with the what was called the 29th Ranger Battalion, which was a Ranger battalion that was raised from the 29th Division, which of course lands at D-Day, and which was disbanded. Their troops were all sent back to the 29th, and they were dispersed. That was the Leslie McNair style. He said they're going to become an elite training force. You get these guys, you get your best troops, you train them, and then you send them back to their units, and then they instill this knowledge of advanced tactics with the rest of the division. The alternative viewpoint is the viewpoint where they're the spearhead for amphibious operations. And that's Pointe du Hoc, and that's Anzio, and that's the landings in North Africa, and that sort of thing. So I think that the mixed Ranger legacy isn't specifically Pointe du Hoc. Rather, it's the controversy about what is the Ranger mission. And the current Ranger units face the same issue. A lot of friends of mine who had Ranger training, they didn't remain with the Rangers. They were armor officers or artillery officers, whatever. They went through Ranger training as part of an elite training, and then to distill those lessons with their home unit. And then, of course, the Rangers do have the mission of being a spearhead elite light infantry force. So the Ranger Force today actually has essentially both missions. It does both the elite training mission and the spearhead mission.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, I'm done with questions. I think there's no more on the sidebar there. So I think, unless you've got any final comments you want to make about Pointe du Hoc, or anything about anything else on D-Day that connects with this?
Not really. I did deal in my book with a lot of other issues. I don't mean to suggest that the issues we talked about today are the only ones, but within an hour's time, that's a kind of a reasonable limit. For people who are interested in the Maisy controversy, as I say, I have a chapter devoted to the Ranger attack. I also have an appendix in the book which actually describes what Maisy was, from the German perspective. What type of battery it was, what was there, what its legacy was, the bombardment attempts against it, that sort of thing. So anyone who's interested in that controversy might want to take a look at it.
Brilliant. And as I say, the links are there in the description, folks. And we've just had a quick question, which probably I can add an S to, but it's what is Steve's next project? But I expect project is a better question to ask.
Actually, I just finished a project for Osprey just literally a few weeks ago. It's actually pretty closely connected to that. I write books in the Osprey Duel series, which take a look at one type of weapon versus another type of weapon. And the duel that I did for this book is called Allied Warships versus the Atlantic Wall. And what it specifically deals with, what the duel is that I deal with, is the Battery Hamburg, which is one of the German coastal batteries up near Cherbourg. It was set upon by a U.S. and Royal Navy naval task force headed by USS Texas, the battleship Texas, on 25 June 1944 during the finale of the Cherbourg campaign. And so I use that as an example of how effective are warships against German coastal batteries. And so it's connected to this because I deal with a lot of the same technical issues, but it's actually a different. It's not directly D-Day connected. It's post D-Day. And as far as future projects, I actually do not have another hardcover project at the moment. I do a lot of Osprey small soft covers, new Vanguard series, the Dual series. I just had a book in the Air Campaign series come out about the oil campaign, the Allied attempts to stamp out German fuel supplies. I'm doing a bunch of books on tanks at the Iron Curtain, Cold War tanks on both sides. So I always have plenty of projects. I do not have a big hardcover project at the moment. I'm actually thinking of potential subjects.
Well, brilliant. Well, I'm just going to take you off screen for a second to remind people what's coming up, and I'll bring you back in to say goodbye in a second. So, folks, next week, really keep an eye on the schedule because it's New Zealand at War Week. So some of the shows are in the morning. I've also got a couple of shows in the evening. So there's nothing on Monday, but there's 2 shows on Tuesday, 1 on Wednesday, but I haven't listed it yet, 2 on Thursday, 1 on Friday. So just keep an eye because with people in the Southern Hemisphere, it's all different times of day. So that may benefit some of you in California because the show on Tuesday is at 4 a.m. UK time. So that's going to be whatever that is, 10 p.m. US time. So it might bring a few more people in for the live shows there. So lots of great stuff. I'm really pleased to bring New Zealand at War to you because it was one of those things I couldn't find any historians. Then in the end, I got loads of them. So I'm looking forward to that. So yeah, keep an eye on the times next week because it's vital that you don't miss them because I think only 1 or 2 shows give it my normal time. So keep an eye on that. Just watch the notifications and make sure you sign up with the little bell to get the updates. But I'm going to bring Steve back on just to say goodbye, basically. So, Steve, I know you always enjoy talking to our group. We always enjoy listening to you, and it was a really nice show, and I think it sits very well with Joanna's show and your first one. It's a nice little 3-volume set on Pointe du Hoc. So thanks very much, and we will see you next time, Steve.
Sounds good. Take care.
Okay, cheers then. So this is Paul Woodadge for WW2TV, so I'll see you all again next week. Cheers, everybody. Bye.